The sewing basket had been mended so many times that the mending had itself become a kind of lace, thread over thread, patch over patch, until the original blue calico was barely visible beneath the history of small repairs. It sat now in the lap of Adeline Foster, her hands still, her eyes fixed on the letter that trembled slightly in the draft from the window. 11 letters in all, spanning 8 months, each one folded and refolded so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth. Thomas Callahan Hale. He signed his name in full every time, as if the whole of it were a kind of promise. He wrote of a mercantile he was building in a town called Widow's Bend, Wyoming, of shelves he had built himself from good pine, of a small apartment above the store with a window that looked out over the whole wide valley. He wrote, in his 4th letter, the one she had read so many times the pencil had begun to fade, that the apartment had 2 rooms, and the second one, he said, could be fixed up, however, a lady might like it. A room of her own making. It was such a plain promise, and yet it had undone her completely. She was 24, and Boston had never once offered her a room of her own making. She had spent her whole life in other people's houses, first her aunt's, then, after the influenza took her aunt too, in a boarding house where she taught penmanship to merchants' daughters for a wage that covered little more than her rent and her solitude. She had answered his advertisement in the matrimonial news with more honesty than she had expected to give a stranger. She had written that she was quick with figures, that she had read every book she could get her hands on, and that she wanted, more than anything, a life that was entirely her own to build. Thomas Hale's reply had not flattered her. It had simply agreed with her, plainly, as though her wanting a life of her own were the most reasonable thing in the world. The train had rattled westward for 4 days, and with every mile the land had grown wider and stranger, the sky pressing down close and enormous, where in Boston it had always seemed a narrow strip caught between rooftops. She had watched the plains give way to a country of red rock and sage, and felt, for the first time, a needle of fear thread itself through her hope. Widow's Bend was smaller than she had pictured. A handful of buildings gathered around a dusty crossing, but she did not mind that. She minded, instead, the platform. It was bare. A single bench, a water tank, a station master's shed with its shutters drawn, and no one at all waiting beneath the tin awning. She stood with her trunk at her feet and told herself that a wagon wheel might have cracked, that a delivery might have run long, that 100 ordinary things might delay a man of business on an ordinary Tuesday. The light slid low and gold across the sage flats, then purpled, then went the color of a bruise, and still no one came. The station master, an old man with tobacco-stained fingers, locked his little office and touched his hat to her without a word, the way a man does when he has seen this particular kind of waiting before and has learned it is kinder not to speak of it. She sat very straight on the bench, with her hands folded in her lap, because sitting straight was the only thing she still had command over, and she watched the first star needle its way into the darkening sky, and told herself she would not cry, not here, not on a strange platform in a strange county, with nothing to her name but a trunk and 11 letters that had turned, in the space of a single sunset, into evidence of her own foolishness. It was full dark when she heard the wagon, not hurried, not a rescue at full gallop, just the steady creak of wheels and the patient clop of a mule, coming down the road at the pace of a man who was in no particular hurry to be anywhere. The wagon slowed as it passed the platform, and a shape leaned out from the seat, no more than an outline against the stars. He sat there a long moment, looking at her the way a man looks at a thing he is trying to make sense of. She braced for him to drive on. Most men, she thought, would have driven on. Instead, he set the brake and climbed down, unhurried, his boots finding the ground with the quiet certainty of a man who has walked over uneven ground his whole life. He was not old, though he moved with the settled weight of someone who had done a great deal of work in his years. And when he came close enough that the lamplight from the shed caught his face, she saw it was serious rather than hard, weathered by sun rather than by unkindness. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, like something poured slow from a jug. "Last train's long gone through." "I know," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. He looked her over, not unkindly, just thoroughly. The trunk, the traveling dress gone gray with dust, the way she held herself so straight it looked as though a single word might crack her down the middle. He did not ask who she had come to meet. He did not ask why they had not come for her. He seemed, somehow, all ready to understand that such questions belonged to her alone, and that a stranger had no right to them yet. "There's a boarding house in town," he said. "Mrs. Odom runs it fair. Clean rooms, decent food, and she doesn't ask questions she isn't owed the answers to." She looked down the dark road toward the scattered lights of the town and understood, with a cold clarity, that she had nowhere else in the whole of the territory to go. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Silas Bellamy." He gestured at the wagon. "I've got feed sacks in the back, but there's room enough for your trunk, if you'll ride up front." He lifted her trunk into the wagon bed with an ease that spoke of long practice, and then he simply climbed back up and waited, not offering his hand, not making a show of gallantry, only waiting for her to climb up beside him in her own time. They rode into town in a silence that was not unkind, only unhurried, the wagon wheels creaking, the mule's harness jingling softly, and somewhere far off a dog barking at nothing in particular. The boarding house was plain and white painted, with a porch light burning yellow in the dark, and a sign that read simply, "Lodging," in neat black letters. Silas Bellamy set her trunk on the step and knocked, and when the door opened it was to reveal a broad, capable woman with iron-gray hair scraped back and eyes that missed nothing at all. "Silas," she said, and then her gaze traveled to Adeline, and something in her face softened at once, the way it does in women who have seen this exact grief before and learned not to name it aloud. "Come in out of the night, dear. You look done in." Adeline turned to thank him properly, but he had already touched the brim of his hat, said something low to Mrs. Odom about putting the week on his account, and was climbing back onto his wagon before she could form the words. He drove off into the dark without looking back, and she stood on the porch and watched the shape of him go, feeling something she could not name settle uneasily in her chest, equal parts gratitude and a strange, hollow disappointment that he had not stayed to be thanked. The room Mrs. Odom gave her was small, clean, and entirely without softness. A narrow bed, a chipped basin, a single window facing the dark street. And it was there, alone at last, that the careful posture she had held all through the long evening finally gave way. She wept for the room that would never be fixed up however a lady might like it, for the shelves of good pine she would never see, for the plain foolishness of having built a whole life out of another person's handwriting. The days that followed passed in the particular grayness of shame that only the abandoned know. She helped Mrs. Odom with the wash and the mending to earn her keep, and Mrs. Odom, who ran the town's only telegraph line as well as its only respectable lodging, proved herself a woman of sharp opinions delivered with a soft and generous heart, and she did not pry, for which Adeline was grateful beyond words. She saw Silas Bellamy only once that week, riding into town for supplies, his face arranged in the same grave, closed lines, and he did not so much as glance toward the boarding house, and she told herself firmly that this was no concern of hers. On the seventh day, with panic beginning to close a slow fist around her ribs at the question of what she would do next, she heard his voice in the front room, low and even, speaking with Mrs. Odom. A knock came at her door a moment later. "Mr. Bellamy's asking after you," Mrs. Odom said, her face carefully unreadable in the way of a woman who already knows more than she is saying. Silas stood in the small front parlor with his hat in his hands, filling the modest room the way certain quiet men fill a space, not through size alone but through a kind of settled gravity. "Miss Foster," he said, and did not waste a single word on pleasantries. "Mrs. Odom tells me you've a good hand for figures and letters both." Adeline glanced at Mrs. Odom, who gave the smallest of nods. She had, in the evenings, helped balance the boarding house accounts, glad of the small order it gave her days. "I am capable," Adeline said simply. "I am not," Silas said, with a plainness that startled her more than any flattery could have. "I've a freight operation, wagons running supply out to the mining camps, and the books have gone to ruin these 3 years past. It is a disaster of ink and torn paper, and I need someone with sense to make order of it. There's a room off the office you could use for the work, and I'll pay a fair wage besides your board here with Mrs. Odom. It was, she understood at once, a lifeline offered without a shred of pity attached to it, a plain solution to an impossible problem. It was work. It was purpose. Yes, she said, and the word came out with more force than she had intended. Yes, Mr. Bellamy. I'll do it gladly. His freight office sat at the edge of town, a long, low building of raw timber with a yard full of wagons and mules, and the room he showed her was little more than a storage closet cleared of crates. But it had a desk, and it had a window, and after the closeness of the boarding house, it felt like a small kingdom entirely her own. The ledgers were every bit the ruin he had promised, receipts wedged between pages like pressed flowers, whole months unaccounted for, sums that did not sum, and for another woman it might have been despair, but for Adeline it was a puzzle laid bare and waiting to be solved, and she set to it with a fierce and quiet satisfaction. Silas was seldom there through the day, out with the wagons on the long haul to the mining camps in the hills, and she came to know him only by the sound of his departure at first light and his return at dusk, dust-covered and silent. On the third morning she found a tin cup of coffee sitting on the corner of her desk, black and still faintly steaming, with no note and no explanation, and no sign of him anywhere in the yard. She drank it, and the next morning it was there again, and the morning after that, until it became an unspoken ritual between them, a small and steady kindness that asked for nothing in return and said, without ever saying it aloud, that he had thought of her before she arrived. He never once mentioned it. She never once thanked him for it aloud. It simply was, every single morning, as reliable as the sunrise. In the long afternoons he sometimes worked in the yard within sight of her window, mending harness or repairing a wagon wheel, and she found herself watching the economy of his movements, the way he never wasted a single motion, the particular set of his shoulders when a long haul had worn him down, the way he would sometimes stop and simply look toward the hills, as though drawing something out of them that the town could not give him. He was a man who spoke almost entirely through what he did, rather than what he said, and she began, slowly, to learn to read that language the way she had once learned her letters. And he, in turn, watched her. He would come in for water and linger a moment too long in the doorway, watching the way the light fell across her dark hair as she bent over the columns, watching the chaos of his accounts resolve itself day by day into clean, ordered rows beneath her steady hand. The office felt different with her in it, less like a place men merely pass through, and more like somewhere a person might actually live. One evening, nearly 2 months into her work, he came in from the yard and set something small and pale on the corner of her desk without a word. It was a horse, no bigger than her palm, carved from cottonwood, its head turned as if caught mid-stride, every line of muscle and motion rendered with a patience that surprised her. She looked up at him, startled. "It's lovely," she said. He only shrugged, a faint color rising along his jaw. "Whittling passes the evenings," he said, and was gone before she could say more. She kept the little horse on the corner of her desk from that day forward, and whenever the old loneliness rose in her like floodwater, she would rest her thumb along its smooth carved back and feel it recede. She finished the ledgers in the first cold weeks of autumn, 3 years of ruin tamed at last into clean and orderly columns, and she brought the finished book to him one evening in the yard. He took it in his rough hands, turning these pages slowly, and it was not the sums he studied but the neatness of her hand, the order she had made where there had been none. "I don't rightly know what to say," he said at last, low. "Thank you, Adeline." It was the first time he had ever used her given name, and it sat strangely well between them, like a key finally turned in a lock long stuck. "The work is finished," she said, and the words hung there, heavier than she meant them to be, because the reason she had any claim at all on his time and his coffee and his small carved gifts had just come to its natural end. He closed the ledger slowly. "There's the mail run still to be sorted," he said, and the accounts for the spring freight. It was not quite a question, though it felt like one. I could see to the correspondence as well, she offered. Yes, he said, quicker than he meant to, she thought. The correspondence. And so she stayed. The arrangement shifted after that into something neither of them named aloud. She was no longer merely his bookkeeper. She took her supper with him most evenings in the little kitchen behind the office, and they ate in a silence that had long since stopped being awkward and had become, instead, a kind of comfort. She mended the tears in his work shirts with the same deft, unhurried hand she brought to his ledgers. She bought a small clay pot of marigolds from the mercantile and set it on the windowsill of the office, a small bright defiance against all that raw timber and dust, and Silas never once remarked on it, though she caught him watering it one morning when he believed himself unobserved. The truth of Thomas Callahan Hale had become, by then, a kind of distant ghost, a foolish girl's dream she rarely let herself revisit, for Wyoming had worn the foolishness out of her and replaced it with something harder and more her own. But ghosts, as it happens, do not always stay buried. On a gray afternoon in October, she was in the mercantile, waiting on a spool of thread when Mrs. Odom, who kept the town's telegraph key in a back corner of the store, looked up from a slip of paper with her brow drawn tight. Odd, she murmured. Wires come through for a Mrs. Hale out at the Bar T Ranch north of here. From her husband, it says. Works the railroad survey crews, comes through with a wire most every month, regular as church bells. Funny name, that. Hale. Only ever heard it the once before. Her voice trailed away as she looked up and saw the color drain entirely from Adeline's face, and in that single, unguarded moment, Mrs. Odom understood everything at once. The matrimonial advertisement never once mentioned, the long wait on the empty platform, the quiet shame that had trailed Adeline through the whole of that autumn. "Oh, you poor child," she said, all her briskness gone soft with sudden sympathy. The name spoken aloud, tethered now to a real wife on a real ranch not 20 miles distant, broke something open in Adeline that was not, in the end, mere heartbreak. It was a colder thing, a clarifying anger. He had not simply changed his mind somewhere along the rails. He had written his pretty promises from inside a life he already shared with another woman, and let a stranger cross half a continent chasing a room that had never once been meant for her. She walked back to the freight office through a fine gray drizzle, the whole of it turning over in her like a stone in a stream, and she knew she had to tell Silas the truth of it, because their whole arrangement had been built on his belief that she had simply been left behind by misfortune, and misfortune was not, in the end, what this was. She found him in the yard, greasing a wagon axle, and she stood watching his sure, capable hands at their work for a long moment before she spoke his name. He looked up, saw her face, and went very still, setting down his tools at once and giving her his full and quiet attention. She told him everything, her voice low and even, betraying nothing of the storm underneath it. The wire, the wife at the Bar T, the long months of lies dressed up as courtship. When she finished, he was silent for a long while, his jaw set tight, a muscle working in his cheek, his eyes fixed not on her but on the far hills, burning with an anger that she understood, with some surprise, was entirely on her behalf and not his own. "There's a marshal in the county seat," he said finally, his voice flat. "Mail fraud's a crime same as any other. He could be made to answer for it." She had already turned the thought over herself, the satisfaction of it, the justice. But she pictured, too, the inquiry, her name become the subject of every kitchen conversation from here to the county line, herself recast forever as the foolish, jilted bride. "And what good would that do me?" she said quietly. "In the end, it won't hand me back my pride, and it won't undo the fool I was for believing him. That debt is mine to carry, not his to pay twice over. I'd rather let it lie. I'd rather go forward than keep looking back at it." He turned his gaze from the hills to her then, and really looked, and saw in her the resilience that bends without ever quite breaking, the particular strength it takes to choose dignity over the satisfaction of revenge. And something in him that had been merely a careful, protective fondness sharpened all at once into something certain. He had grown so used to the smell of her bread in his kitchen, the particular quiet of her company of an evening, that he had not once noticed how thoroughly she had become necessary to him, until the thought of the office and the kitchen going back to their old emptiness struck him as something close to unbearable. He had been slow, he understood now, slow to see what had been forming right in front of him. That evening they sat as they always did on the low step outside the office, watching the first stars prick through the deepening blue, and the quiet between them was different than usual, charged with all that had been said that day, and all that had not yet been. "Adeline," he said, breaking it. She turned to him. "I've been turning something over," he said, his voice rougher than its usual even register, his hands set on his knees as if to anchor himself there. "This place has been quiet a long time. Too quiet, I begin to think, before you came into it." He looked at her, direct and plain. "It doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels right, having you in it." He drew a breath. "The work's done, and you've no more reason to stay on my account, but I find I'm hoping you will anyway. I find I want you here for reasons that have got nothing to do with ledgers at all." He stood and walked to the yard rail, looking out into the dark. "This has been an empty place too long, Adeline. It doesn't have to stay that way. I'd like it if you'd stay on, not as the woman who keeps my books, but as my wife." The whole evening seemed to still around that single sentence, the wind in the sage falling quiet, the creak of harness leather from the barn fading into nothing, until there was only his plain, unhurried offering hanging in the cold night air. It was not flowery. It asked for nothing it had not already earned. She rose and came to stand beside him at the rail, studying the strong, tired line of his jaw, the steadiness that had never once wavered in his eyes since the night he had climbed down from his wagon on a dark platform. He had not promised her a room fixed up however she liked, or shelves of good pine, or a view over a wide valley. He had offered her only himself, steady and plain and entirely real, and she understood, standing there, that it was by far the better promise. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but certain, "I was hoping you'd ask me that." A smile broke slowly across his serious face, transforming it entirely, the first true smile she had ever seen him give, and it reached all the way to his eyes. Their courtship that followed was as plain and unadorned as his proposal had been, built of shared suppers where they spoke for the first time not of freight schedules but of their whole pasts, his parents who had carved the freight line out of nothing and now lay in the small cemetery north of town, her years in Boston, and the particular loneliness of teaching other women's daughters to write letters she herself had no one to send. They walked out on Sunday afternoons along the dry creek bed, and he taught her the names of the wildflowers that clung stubbornly to the red rock, and she came to understand that this, too, was its own kind of courtship, the quiet weaving together of two lives that had each been solitary far too long. They were married in December, in the small clapboard church in Widow's Bend, with Mrs. Odom standing as witness and dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed, unconvincingly, was only there because of the cold. Adeline wore a plain blue dress she had sewn herself. Silas wore his one good suit and looked entirely uncomfortable and entirely resolute at once. The whole town turned out to see it, their faces carrying the particular satisfaction of people who had watched a story unfold from its saddest beginning and found, in the end, that it had turned out exactly as it ought. 5 years on, the evening light lay long and gold across the porch of the house Silas had built for her at the edge of the freight yard, and Adeline sat in her rocking chair with a small boy's torn shirt in her lap, her needle moving steady in the fading light. A girl of 3, with her father's grave dark eyes and her mother's unruly curls, sat at her feet lining up smooth creek stones with immense concentration. Silas came and settled into the chair beside her with the particular weary sigh of a man who has spent the day breaking a green colt to harness, and reached over to tuck a loose strand of hair back from her face with a touch that had long since become as familiar as breathing. Their son came tearing around the corner of the house, chasing a hen with a stick, hollering with fierce and total joy, and Silas called out, low and amused, "Daniel Bellamy, leave that hen be. She's got more sense in her than you do." And the boy stopped at once, grinned a gap-toothed grin at his father, dropped the stick, and came to lean against his father's knee. Adeline looked at the whole of it. Her husband, her children, the small carved horse still sitting on the windowsill inside where it had sat for 5 years now, and felt a wave of peace move through her so complete it was almost startling. The house behind them was no longer quiet at all. It was full of noise and small arguments, and the thud of bare feet on plank floors, and the window over her kitchen sink. She realized, looking back at it, faced east, just as she had once been promised by a man who had never meant a single word of it. The morning sun poured through it every day of her life now, all the same, just as promised, only by the man who had actually meant to give it to her. It was, she thought, a strange and lovely thing, how a lie could become the very road that carried her to something truer than anything she had ever let herself hope for. "Sun was pretty this morning," she said softly, and Silas looked over at her and understood at once she was not talking about the weather at all. He took her hand, his thumb moving slow across her knuckles. "Still can't rightly believe how long it took me to see straight where those ledgers were concerned," he said, a teasing warmth in his voice. "You were slow," she agreed, smiling. "Good thing you had someone come along to fix your accounts." "Good thing I had someone come along to fix me," he said, quiet and entirely in earnest, and they sat together as the last light drained out of the sky and the first stars came on, one by one, over a house that was not empty at all, and never would be again. Sometimes the promise someone breaks is the very thing that walks you toward the one who keeps it. Adeline never got the window she was promised, but she got a better one, built by a man who showed his love in coffee cups and carved wood instead of pretty words. So if life hands you an empty house tonight, don't lose heart. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right person to fill it. A small note for you. This story was written and imagined by AI purely to bring you a little entertainment, while hopefully leaving behind a warm and positive lesson too.